part of a larger project that I'm engaged in, sort of looking at US foreign policy in South Asia. And really, what I would like to propose to you in the 20 minutes or so that I have here is the idea that we need to rethink the US policy in Afghanistan, or at least rather the international community's policy in Afghanistan. Really kind of what I would like to suggest to you today is that with the presence of the Pashtun in Afghanistan, the only option that we really have is to contain Afghanistan, to keep the problem from cascading overseas. So kind of my argument is that it doesn't really matter how many GIs and how much money we pour into Afghanistan until we understand the nature of our enemy, or the opponent, which is predominantly made of Pashtuns. We're not really going to solve the problem. So let me see if I got this right. How do I move? Yeah. So I'll give a short history of Afghanistan, because I think it's very important to understand the nature of this conflict, and then I'll focus on the Pashtun, and I think I'll probably end on that one. And I'll be happy to take questions on whether it is the Afghan Jihad or why AFPAC itself is unlikely to succeed. In terms of sources, what I do, again, I think it's important to, because I'm at a university, I always like to tell students, try and use a multitude of sources, and I tend to use both open sources and security personnel. So again, I try and get as clear a view as possible from what is available there. Just to give you an idea, Afghanistan is a pretty large country, about 647,000 square kilometers, about a population of about 31 million, predominantly Sunni Muslim, but there is a very strong Wahhabi presence. There is a very powerful Shia community there, and as we saw in the election, the Shia certainly have had some element of influence on policy making. In terms of the languages, it's really Dari and Pashto, but the Afghan constitution permits certain indigenous languages to be respected. The core ethnic group in Afghanistan is really the Pashtun. They compose about 40% of the population. The Tajik and the Hazaras and the Uzbeks are also as important. But I really kind of want to focus on the Pashtun. And the reason for that is the Pashtun really created Afghanistan. It was established by an individual by the name of Ahmed Khan Durrani. Durrani, he was known is because he had a pearl earring, and it was established in the 18th century. And throughout Afghanistan's history, really, the Pashtuns and predominantly the Durrani tribe have been very, very powerful and have governed and managed Afghanistan. They've also had some very strong individuals. For example, Abdul Rahman Khan, from 1880 to 1901, is sometimes known as the Iron Amir. And the reason for that is that he, at one instance, transferred a very large group of Pashtuns from one area of the country, from the southern part, towards the Uzbeki sort of border. And the reason why he did that is that, first of all, to quell a rebellion that was taking place, and secondly, to divide and rule kind of thing. And that's an important element to remember, is that Afghanistan, when it survived under a very strong rulership. Again, when we're looking at this particular country, remember that it is very tribal-based, it's very ethnic-based. The Pashtun themselves are a unique group of people. The key element of them are the Durrani, the Ghizalis, from which, for example, Mullah Omar comes from. But what I'm trying to suggest to you today is that if you can see here, in terms of the ethnic composition, as sort of how the Pashtun are spread out across the country. The purple is the Pashtun, and as you can see, they're pretty much spread throughout Afghanistan. And throughout Afghan history, certainly since 1947 with the creation of Pakistan, there has been a rising movement towards the creation of a Pashtun state in the southern part, sort of where Quetta is towards Kandahar. And that has certainly been an element in undermining stability in Afghanistan and, of course, in Pakistan. The other element that I would like to suggest to you is that without understanding this ethnic element of Afghanistan, we cannot even begin to grapple with some of the challenges that this fascinating country holds. Now, when we look at Afghanistan, look at it in terms of layers. The most important part of the Afghan Pashtun nature is the family. Okay? Dad and the number of wives and the children. But within that, the next step up is the clan. And you, in a sense, you take allegiance to the clan, and then, of course, to the tribe and to the confederation. And the reason why that's so important is that, as we saw in the recent election, individuals vote according to family, clan, tribe, confederation. And it's been a predominant theme of Afghan politics for hundreds of years. And I'm proposing to you is that this is unlikely to change. The core emphasis of the Pashtun existence is Pashtunawali, which is known as the Code of the Pashtun. And again, the reason why this is so important is because when we're looking at the Pashtun, the two key emphases are hospitality and safe conduct and honor. Honor is ever so important for the Pashtun. A Pashtun person will not accept any slight on their honor or their offense. And when I mean honor, I mean also the family. If you offend an individual Pashtun, you offend the family, you offend the tribe, and you offend the confederation. And there are a variety of stories to emphasize folklore that emphasize the importance of this. One instance is, again, about an elderly woman, village woman, and bandits came to her village. The bandits killed 2 individuals. They escaped. They were pursued by a posse, and they found sanctuary at the home of this woman. As the pursuers came to the house, they said to the woman, "We would like these bandits because they killed 2 men." It then transpired that they actually killed this woman's 2 sons, her only 2 sons, also her source of income as a result. And yet this woman refused to turn the men over because she said, "These guys asked for my hospitality. And even though they have killed my sons, I am honor bound to provide them with hospitality and with safe conduct." And there is an argument that one of the reasons why we've been unable to track Al-Qaeda or elements of Al-Qaeda is because they have received hospitality and safe conduct from Pashtuni elements in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. So again, what I would urge you to think about when you're looking into Afghanistan is that this is a very traditional society, an honor-bound society, and they take honor very, very seriously, which is also why the issue of revenge becomes very important. Okay? If somebody offends you, you cannot allow that offense to go by unpunished, even if it takes 100 years. Okay? You have to accept that. Okay? And again, there is a Pashtun saying that says, 100 years had passed and I took my revenge, and even then I took it too soon. So again, this is the type of community and culture that we are discussing. What this kind of table is proposing to you is how this element, how the tribal and the clan emphasis develops. As you can see at the bottom, you've got the call, i.e. the small family unit. And as I suggested to you, a father, a couple of wives maybe, and a lot of children around. Once they grow, once the children kind of leave the nest, and when I say children, I probably mean about 20 or 30 or even 40 people, they create a larger lineage group known as the Kel. When that grows, it then becomes a tribe. And this is a process that takes, that develops over a substantive amount of time. Okay? The Pashtun don't have the same notion of time as we do. I mean, we want everything right now. After all, we have iPhones and Blackberries. That's the nature of our society. For this society, it's time. And again, they're willing to wait and they're willing to develop. There is another very important concept when we're looking at the Pashtun, and this is this concept of Tarbawali. And Pashtun society, the issue of land is key. Okay? If you own land, or if you have land, that means that you have a voice in the local council, in the jirga. You can speak. That means that you are worth something. And if you don't, you're pretty much nothing. You are a fakir. And again, in Pashtun, that means without a voice. This is, again, emphasizing the importance of land in that community. But what also happens in Afghanistan is that because land is at a premium, especially arable land, it often puts cousins, because they intermarry. First cousins do intermarry in Afghanistan. It puts cousins at odds. Because if one doesn't get the land, that means that they lose their voices. And that's an important element when we are looking at how society develops in Afghanistan. And of course, as the population increases, so are pressures on useful land. I'm just going to say just a couple of words on the Afghan Jihad, and then I think I have like 5 minutes left, so that kind of fits nicely. The Afghan Jihad started in 1979, and here the Pashtun played a very important role. It was really the Pashtun who led the campaign against the Soviet presence. And the reason why that was ever so important, I'm not undermining the role of the Uzbeks and the Tajiks and the Hazaras, because there were two of the main Mujahideen groups who were led by Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Hazaras. But the Pashtun led the way is because, again, of the nature of their society. It is a very strong, powerful warrior mentality. And what we saw there is that a lot of youngsters left Afghanistan, went to the refugee camps in Pakistan, where they were receiving Islamic indoctrination. They became what we call the new Maliks, i.e. new powerful individuals to lead the campaign against the Soviet Union. And we have to remember, I mean, this was a very brutal war. I mean, the laws of armed conflict didn't exist here. There was no Geneva Convention. There was no Red Cross. This was a scorched earth campaign that the Soviet run against the indigenous Afghan population. But there was also the element of civil conflict, because Pashtun killed Pashtuns. It was also about the fact that if a Pashtun fighting for the Afghan government killed somebody, killed another Pashtun, his family had to take revenge. So as a result, the Afghan Jihad kind of cascaded, building on these tribal element of the Afghan people, and with a new sort of influence of radical Islam, what we saw is a very powerful individual emerging, the Mujahideen, a holy warrior. And certainly both the Pakistani ISI, the security services, and others have used these young men and have corrupted them in such a way that they have become fixated with promoting their agenda. And I think that we're still feeling the legacy of the Afghan Jihad. And I'm at a loss as to how we can remedy that element. I mean, we have to remember Afghanistan lost a generation of young men who were also very poorly educated. So kind of just to sum up, essentially when we're looking at this community, we're looking at a very poor community, but a community where honor is very important. Where a community where individuals who have offended the tribe or the family, you have to take revenge against them. Secondly, we're talking about jihad. Okay? We have to purify Afghanistan from the infidels. In 1979 to 89, that was the Soviet Union. Nowadays, of course, they see the international force as the infidels, as the occupiers. And again, here they bring traditional Islamic jihad doctrine as developed by people such as Said Qutb and Sheikh Abdullah Azam to encourage that notion. So what we get is, if you like, in the last circle, is that your typical Afghan Pashtun fighter is somebody who's motivated by religion. Normally it's either Wahhabi or Deobandi religion. Economics, i.e. predominantly poverty, but most importantly, tribal values. And again, I think under General McChrystal, we're seeing a very unique approach to Afghanistan's issues, where General McChrystal and others are trying to impose security, but also reconstruction, but I'm unsure as to how effective it will be.
Well, that was a fabulous presentation, following up on, set a high standard. Having heard that, I want to say it's good to see we're finally placing appropriate focus on Afghanistan. For a while there, this was sort of the neglected war, and our effort there suffered dearly because of it. And it's good to see the current president and the academic community finally take devote the proper resources to this war. It will not be won otherwise, and it may not be won with our best efforts. Having said that, I think there's been a tendency recently to downgrade the importance of Iraq. This was sort of a traumatic experience for many Americans, and I think a lot of people would like to see this done and over with. We'd like to see it swept up under the rug, put behind us, and unfortunately, things will not move so easily over there. This will require our utmost attention and our resources. Iraq is by no means over. The violence has declined dramatically. The Iraqis are stepping up. There's certainly progress there, but it's a very fragile situation, and Iraq is of such great strategic importance, in many ways much more so than Afghanistan, that we would do great harm to our interests and to the region if we sort of neglected this. So the big event in Iraq, it was the elections. They held national elections March 7th. The election results have not been fully announced yet. This Friday, we're expected to hear the full tally. We have 95% of the results in, so we have a good idea of where we stand. So I want to go into that a bit, but first I think maybe just a primer to how we got here and set up a little background. Most of you are familiar, 2003, the invasion, we had sort of a descent into chaos through 2005-2006 period where the country really sort of fell into a civil war, tremendous violence, Sunni on Shiite violence. In January 2007, the surge was announced. We started to see progress, not only from increased U.S. troop presence, but from turning of some of these Sunni tribal militias. The Awakenings Councils turned against al-Qaeda, were offended by their brutality, came over to our side. December 2008, we signed a status of forces agreement with the Iraqi government. February 2009, President Obama announced that we would be withdrawing most of our combat troops by August of this year, and all of our troops by December of next year. Also in 2009, the current Prime Minister of Iraq, Nouri al-Maliki, sort of asserted his control over the country and really sort of made a name for himself. This was a somewhat obscure politician beforehand, and in April of 2009, he led an effort into the southern city of Basra to cleanse it of Shiite militia forces there. This is his own sect. He's a Shiite prime minister. Led Iraqi security forces into Basra to cleanse it of these militias and really sort of made a name for himself and sort of rose to prominence after this, built a real constituency, which we see playing out in the elections now, which leads us to this set of elections. Iraqi politics, it's unusual. I think it's important to understand that Iraq has unusual cleavages in the country. Shiites are a majority in Iraq, which is unusual for the Middle East. Sunnis are perhaps 85%. 85% of all Muslims in the world are Sunni, and in the Middle East they predominate as well. There are very few Shiite majority countries. Iraq is one of the few Arab Shiite majority countries. So Saddam Hussein was a Sunni, and when he was overthrown and we moved to a democratic system, a lot of the Shiites came to power through the first democratic elections, and this made a lot of Sunni Arabs in the region very nervous and overturned the order there. And these cleavages have sort of played out in Iraq's politics ever since. Shiites have voted for Shiite parties, Sunnis have voted for Sunni parties. Then you have another cleavage along ethnic lines. You have Kurds in the north, you have Arabs throughout much of central and southern Iraq who also vote along ethnic lines. Obviously, a big worry of the United States was to somehow try and bridge these divides. You don't want this confessional sectarian politics to dominate throughout Iraq's political future. You want broad coalitions. You want groups coordinating with one another. And to a degree, these elections have sort of shown some progress on that front. So without going into too much detail, I just want to, national parliamentary elections, March 7th, they had 63% turnout. This is for a 325-member parliament. You had 4 major parties now vying for influence in Iraq. You have the current party, ruling party, actually they're alliances, groups of parties. The state of law under the current Prime Minister, Nouri al-Maliki, was expected to do well and did. They won about 92 seats, which would tie them for first in this next government. So that's 92 out of 325. You need a majority, simple majority, to form a government. So they're well positioned. He has taken a step back from the sectarian politics that he practiced before, just joining other Shiite political parties, banding together, campaigning on Shiite identity, and has become more of a nationalist. So he's tried to bring in some Sunnis. He's tried to distance himself from Iran, which is the main Shiite power in the region, who everyone is afraid the Shiites of Iraq are beholden to Iran. He's tried to become national security. He's campaigned on a national security and nationalistic platform, and he's done quite well. The surprise in this election has been the Iraqi national movement. This is led by a man named Iyad Alawi, who is actually a former prime minister of Iraq, an interim prime minister, 2004 and 2005. He was sort of our guy in Iraq for a while. He was the West's man. He's who Washington would have liked to have won the 2005 election. He was down in single digits approval ratings for the longest time. Everybody had written him off, and he made sort of a stunning comeback in this election. I mean, surprised a lot of people. In the last few weeks, the momentum started to build. He's heading the Iraqi national movement. Now, he is a Shiite as well, just like the prime minister, but he has mass appeal to Sunnis because he's completely disavowed this sectarian politics. He's made an effort to reach out to all religious groups, and Sunnis have really rallied behind him, including Sunnis abroad. Saudi Arabia is the major Sunni power in the region, and they have thrown their weight behind him. They like the fact that he has appealed to everyone in Iraq, that he's not beholden to Iran. So he draws his constituency from Sunnis and Shiites, supported by the West, supported by Saudi Arabia, by Syria to an extent. He's won 92, what looks like 92 seats. So it looks like they're about in a tie for 92 seats. Now, obviously, to get to the simple majority, you need to form a coalition. So the third most powerful player is the Iraqi National Alliance, which is where the prime minister used to belong to. This is the coalition of Shiite parties, Islamist Shiite parties, many of them close to Iran. It's actually comprised mainly of 2 parties that used to hate one another, the movement of Muqtada al-Sadr and a movement that has taken on several acronyms now, but it now goes by ISKI, which has a Badr brigade who controls much of the territory in southern Iraq. Now, these two battled each other for quite some time in 2006, 2007. Iran has brought them together. Iran would like to see a large Shiite Islamist coalition come to power in Baghdad that is friendly towards Tehran, and has backed them all the way. Now, they've won 70 seats. So you've got the first 2 parties with 92 each. Now you've got this Shiite alliance, the Iraqi National Alliance, with 70 seats. And then following up at the end is the Kurdistan Alliance. Now the Kurds, as I said, are a separate ethnic group from the Arabs. They are Sunni Muslims. There's no religious divide here, but they practice Islam very differently than some of the Arab groups. They have what is a semi-autonomous region carved out of the north. They were heavily oppressed under Saddam Hussein. After the '91 Gulf War, the United States carved out a no-fly zone in Iraq's north to allow the Kurds some degree of autonomy and safety there. After the 2003 invasion, they have sort of built their own governance. They have their own militia. They have their own security forces. They're in a constant battle with Baghdad to see who will control security, the economy of the region, several disputes with the Arabs. But they two of the main parties in Iraqi Kurdistan joined together for national elections, and they won 56 seats. So political analysts, some of the best Iraq experts in D.C. are unsure of what's going to happen here. There's no clear path forward. Now, the current Prime Minister Maliki allied with many of these Shiite Islamist groups before, and it wouldn't be beyond reason to suspect that they might form another alliance. This poses risks because, again, the Sunnis would be marginalized. Their one candidate would be marginalized. The Sunnis, after having been in power in Iraq for quite some time, and then our invasion sort of overturning that, have really felt marginalized is the best word, but they stayed out of the elections of '05. They didn't come and vote. They're underrepresented in the government. They fueled much of the insurgency. It was Sunnis that joined many of these militias that became recruits for al-Qaeda. So the United States has really been pushing to have a government more inclusive, that the Sunnis feel like they're part of this national government. And Alawi, to a degree, represents that. And the fear is that if he's sidelined, that if Maliki's state of law and the Iraqi National Alliance form another coalition, that we could have a return to violence. To get out of that, we can certainly talk about it more in Q&A if you'd like. So just briefly, some of the challenges ahead the new Iraqi government, whenever it forms, will have to deal with. I mean, this could take, the last government took 6 months to form. So, you know, in these parliamentary democracies, there's jockeying, different groups want different cabinet posts, and a great deal of back and forth. When they do come in, they will have to deal with the Kurdish question. How much autonomy will Iraqi Kurdistan have? There's a question over Kirkuk, which is a city in northern Iraq that straddles the Kurdish region. 13% of Iraq's oil reserves sit under it. Now, it's currently in an Arab province, but the Kurds insist that it's been a majority Kurd city forever, and that they were pushed out of the city by Saddam Hussein, who forcibly migrated them away. They would like to hold a referendum in Kirkuk to see whether it will join Kurdistan or Iraq proper. This has been delayed several times. There's not a clear resolution in sight, and there's certainly a risk for great tensions, if not violence, at some point when this comes to a resolution. Oil revenue sharing, similar. There's a lot of oil in northern Iraq. Will the Kurds be able to sign their own oil contracts with international companies, as they've already done, or do these have to go through Baghdad? Who has the authority to do that? Where does the money go after it's made? What percentage does each province get? What percentage do the provinces that don't have oil get? Sunni awakening fighters. Complementing the surge, many Sunnis joined the United States in the fight against al-Qaeda. They've been on our payroll for some time. It's always been our hope that the Iraqi government would take these on and integrate them into the security services, and this has happened at a disappointing pace, to say the least. 10–20% of 100,000 fighters have been integrated. The rest are growing disenchanted, upset. There's a fear they could return to arms. The Shiite-led government does not want to integrate them into the security forces. They are wary of them, distrustful. What's going to happen to these people? The United States, and I'll end on this. There's others, but we can address them in Q&A. How are we going to perform? We are set to have our combat troops out in a few months. We are set to have all troops out at the end of next year. We are going to be transitioning from a military presence to a civilian presence. We have 26 provincial reconstruction teams there. That will be cut by 2/3 by next year, I believe. How will our civilian presence affect how Iraq moves forward? How much will we intervene? How much are we going to interject ourselves into Iraqi political negotiations? Are we going to act as an arbiter for some of these disputes, or are we going to take a hands-off approach? There's a big dispute in Washington over what's best to move forward here? Do we leave it up to them to solve their own differences? This is their country now. Or in the past, we've had to step in and play what turned out to be a very helpful and productive role arbitrating. How we transition to that will play a big role in how Iraq moves into the future. Thank you.
I want to frame my discussion in terms of the previous two, which were excellent. I think mine fits rather nicely because I'll be talking about Afghanistan, which was so well described in terms of historical and social factors by Isaac, but I'm going to take more of a political lens and look at the evolution of the intervention there and how that has played out in Afghan politics. I worked on the elections in 2005, and most recently took a leave of absence from USIP to be one of the commissioners on the Election Complaints Commission for the 2009 elections. So I was witness to the chaos and the fraud that took place there. So I want to draw some lessons from that in the context of Afghanistan's development, and then conclude with some comments about where do we go from here, because I think the situation is somewhat grave. To begin, I think that where we find ourselves in Afghanistan in some ways is back at the beginning. The bomb process that started in early 2002 to set a new constitution, to set an interim administration, took place after the Taliban had left, and the focus was on governance and setting up the institutions for democracy so that Afghanistan could be self-governing and prevent the kind of destabilizing influences that let al-Qaeda get in the first place. We now have had 8, almost 9 years of intense intervention, lots of money, lots of soldiers, lots of lives are spent, and we find ourselves now, after the elections in 2009, focusing on governance and how to sustain democracy in Afghanistan. So let me just look at this in 3 parts that I think somewhat explain how we got to where we are now. The first phase is really the transitional administration. So the period from the bomb process where the victorious leaders of Afghanistan that routed the Taliban came together to set a new government. Notably, that did not include the Taliban. They were quite marginalized, and there's a good debate going on now whether or not that was a mistake, given that we now want to talk to the Taliban when they have a much more strengthened position. But in the bomb process, in the transitional administration that followed until the presidential elections in 2004, I think you had several opportunities for progress. You had a good security situation. There really wasn't much fighting. You had a spirit of national optimism. Afghans were quite happy to have the Taliban gone and quite happy to have the international community in, helping them to develop after so many years of war. You also had a strong and unified international commitment. Remember, this started off, rhetorically speaking, as the good war. This was where we were attacked from on 9/11. Europe was with us. The Afghans were with us. And there was a lot of money and goodwill internationally to devote to the project. The things that you did not have happening in this transitional administration were development, because people didn't really know how to deliver aid to very rural areas that were highly underdeveloped. And you did not have disarmament, because the main players in the political scene at the time were also the leaders of the factions that fought each other in the Civil War. And they were also the factions that helped us as proxies to rout the Taliban. So there was a reluctance on the part of the international community to really force disarmament of these leaders. And as I'll explain, I think that has come back to haunt us in some ways now. The conclusion of the interim period was really the presidential elections, which elected Karzai to the first term. These were recognized as relatively free and fair. Karzai won a significant majority, and that really was the capstone of the interim administration that was heavily run by the international community. I think the beginning of the second phase was actually where I came into Afghanistan in terms of the parliamentary elections that took place in 2005. This would, in fact, complete the government and make Afghanistan fully sovereign and autonomous. The elections were seen as relatively free and fair. The problem was who wound up running and who wound up winning. Many of the warlords who had preyed upon Afghanistan and its citizens during the 90s and fought each other were potentially going to be disqualified from the elections because of their links with the illegal armed groups. There was a clause in the election law that was supposed to outlaw them. This was only sporadically enforced, however, and not surprisingly, those who had the weapons that were not disarmed, those who had the money and the influence from the previous era, wound up getting positions of power in the government. If not in the parliament, then they were appointed by Karzai to the cabinet. And you see in 2005, I think the beginning of a steady decline in the governance situation there. You have some very credible ministers who were nominated to the initial cabinet during the interim administration quitting because of who their colleagues were and where they saw the government going. You also had a deteriorating security situation. By 2005, the Taliban were an increasing presence. By 2006, the insurgency really started in more earnest. And I think there are several reasons that we could get into in questions and answers about that. One was a focus that had been on Iraq, and the situation there was not going particularly well. But also there had been underinvestment, both in governance and in terms of making the Afghan government self-sustaining, but also in terms of security. Police training was going poorly. The army was reasonably credible but small, and the Taliban had sanctuaries in Pakistan that they were exploiting in order to gain an advantage to take territory in the south. So you have a rising insurgency, you have an underinvestment of resources in governance, and then the two started working against each other. The more areas that were insecure, the less able the international community with the Afghan government were to improve governance, to improve services, and to run programs in any of the conflict-ridden areas. I think that those years between 2006 and 2009 really were a lost opportunity, and things really spiraled downward relatively unchecked. When the 2009 election process came along, I think we were at a bit of a crossroads, and there's really an opportunity for reform. President Karzai's popularity had been declining for quite some time, and we also had a new administration in the US that had taken a fresh look at this and had announced a new policy. The problems, I think, of the previous years have started to become recognized both by the US and its European partners, which were corruption, lack of delivery of services to rural areas, the lack of justice, the lack of security. So it's interesting when you look at the Obama policy that was announced before the elections, after he and his administration did a policy review, you find that the focus was first, in the first paragraph about al-Qaeda, we need to deny a safe haven for al-Qaeda and prevent terrorism from re-emerging on Afghan soil. But it quickly then shifted to governance and maintaining the rule of law, enhancing the credibility of the Afghan government in the eyes of its people. And then this was soon echoed during the election process by McChrystal's military strategy, and the heart of counterinsurgency being population-centric, focusing on how the Afghan people can respect their government and support it at the same time as a way to eliminate space for the Taliban or terrorist elements to gain a foothold. So how did that process play out? The 2009 elections, it's interesting. I started my job working on the Complaints Commission in April, and just before I left, the conventional wisdom in Washington and in Afghanistan was that Karzai may well be finished. His popularity was quite low. There were rumors that a number of his former cabinet members who had left the government and became part of the opposition would unite and form a super coalition that would have broad-based credibility, and he being weak and we looking for a new strategy meant that change was at hand. As it turned out, by the end of the nomination period, for a variety of reasons, several of these credible, shall I say, westernized former ministers decided not to run. There was one that ran, which is Abdullah, who finished second. you also had a few rivals to power that were part of the Pashtun, Karzai's Pashtun vote base, who had threatened to run and probably would have done a lot of damage by dividing the vote. They then were persuaded not to run by various means. So you wind up having Karzai against Abdullah and then a field of 42 other candidates. And immediately the conventional wisdom switched back. Oh, Karzai's got it in the bag. He's managed to co-opt all of his rivals. And that status quo, as the election process began, I think is interesting in terms of drawing lessons of what happened next, because even though Karzai was seen, at least in the media and by many commentators, as having a huge advantage in the election, there still was a tremendous amount of fraud that was committed on his behalf. I say that carefully because, you know, the work of the Complaints Commission was to investigate fraud and sanction it, and ultimately we eliminated about 1.2 million votes from the presidential election. Most of those were for Karzai. Several 100,000 were for other candidates, so it wasn't like Karzai was the exclusive beneficiary of fraud. But also, I wouldn't go so far as to say that this was all engineered from the top. I think there are many reasons why Afghans committed the fraud, receiving patronage at a later date, proving to the likely winner that you supported him so much and therefore deserve either development money or positions is a strong motivator in Afghanistan as well. But overall, what you see is a tremendous overreach by people seeking to corrupt the democratic process there and really, you know, delegitimize the election and I think undermine the credibility of the government that would come out of it. Perhaps more instructive than the fraud itself is the reaction that the government had to the fraud, which is to say that they did not accept it, even though I think it was again widely believed that in the event of a runoff, which was ultimately declared, President Karzai would have a huge advantage there and would likely win. Yet he resisted up to the very last minute, almost literally, accepting the results and bowing to pressure from the international community, from the opposition, from observer groups to go along with the process and accept the results. As it happened, he did bow to this pressure, and then, for those that have followed, the second place candidate Abdullah withdrew, and then Karzai by default was declared the winner. Now, I actually think that that was probably the best outcome possible under the circumstances. And I think that polls have shown that Afghans recognize that Karzai is the rightful leader, that he had more popular support. But at the same time, I think this did serious damage to Karzai's reputation and to people's perception of government, which was low before, and this did nothing to correct. And it also revealed some significant things about the influence of the international community. So, two things on that point. One is that I think that the process of the 2009 elections showed we're showing in relief how big the problem of corruption is, how big the problem of impunity is. Because for people to think that they could get away with such obvious fraud is really a reaction to the fact that the rule of law had not been enforced in any way by the government up until then. So if anything, it's a stress test on the strength of Afghanistan's democracy, and I think it failed. The second main point that I alluded to is that it really revealed how little leverage, unfortunately, the international community and the U.S. as the most dominant member of that has in terms of influencing outcomes, political outcomes especially, in Afghanistan, which is to say that in the negotiations that occurred, and you know, I can say from Kabul it was high drama for about a week, and it was covered widely in the press. And Senator Kerry came by, and the Secretary General was making calls to Karzai. You must follow the process. You must accept this results. We have troops that are waiting to come in as part of the surge, and this will help you, and therefore you should just go with the process. We'll support you when you win, but it needs to be legitimate. And all of this was resisted until the very last moment. And you know, I think that shows that, in fact, I describe it as Karzai playing a game of chicken with the international community in terms of with the fate of Afghanistan and its future at risk. And he played it to the very end, and I think he wound up winning. And I think he wound up essentially calling the bluff of the international community, and the US in particular, to say, well, you know, what have you got to offer me? Lay it all on the table. And then at the end of all that, once all the cards have been played, he basically said, okay, well, I will accept this result. But what was also needed was reform, and this was what was urged. And that's what we haven't seen yet. And the question is, do we have the leverage, and do we have the leverage to push that? And does he have the recognition of the problem to enforce it himself? And I have real questions about that. Because if you look at what's happened so far, in terms of nomination of the cabinet, there are some credible cabinet members for sure, but many were a step backwards in terms of either their competence or their qualifications for their office. And so that's one example of where we can try to ascertain whether there's going to be a reform agenda in the next Karzai administration or not. I think there are other indicators that show, well, most prominently in terms of the elections, looking ahead to 2010, where the parliament is going to be elected, Karzai issued a presidential decree which effectively revised the electoral law and made it so that he actually nominates both members of the Election Commission and the Election Complaints Commission together. Again, this is not a good sign that with all the problems of the elections and all the calls by observer organizations for reform that this will necessarily be forthcoming. Let me then just touch upon some of the current events and where I see things going and possible chances to turn things around and achieve some successes. First, in the news most recently is the offensive that the US forces as part of the surge waged in Marja in Helmand. And this has been a largely successful operation. The Taliban put up, you know, a modest resistance, and as of last week, both international civilians and, importantly, Afghan civilian agencies, the line ministries for rural rehabilitation and development, for police and so on, are moving in to establish local government and to show to the people that the Afghan government can really provide for them much better than the Taliban. So that's been a success, and the model will now be employed in a much more difficult operation in Kandahar. And that's something that is promising, that we have the international community actually working in an integrated fashion with the Afghan government. And let's see how that develops, because this maybe is a model to use that can be progressively employed to roll back gains the Taliban have made. The second recent point is obviously the decision to talk to the Taliban. The reconciliation effort that the Afghan government is leading, but the US is willing to support, I think, is a good sign. And that gets back to what I said earlier, that it's fairly well recognized that it was a mistake to completely shut the Taliban out of the initial negotiations in forming an Afghan government at the Bonn conference. The Taliban have maybe shifted their interests and are more resistant now to a solution, but talking is definitely the right first step. I think the caution there is that expectation shouldn't be that it will be concluded quickly, and it shouldn't happen too quickly, because there are so many differences that need to be resolved. It won't happen according to a 12-month timetable or by a particular conference date, but it is good to be exploring these options. The focus on governance also needs to be directed specifically at the parliamentary elections, because they are the ones that will act as a check on the power of the executive branch, which is already quite high. I mean, a credible parliament is essential to establishing balanced government in Afghanistan. And in turn, the caution that I sounded in terms of revisions to the electoral law need to be monitored very carefully. And you need to make sure that these elections are better than the last one, so that Afghans can see that democracy is actually a force for change rather than ratifying the old power structure. There's a strong need to marginalize corrupt and criminal actors. Cronyism has become a major problem in the government. This is something that really is largely up to President Karzai and his advisors. The way the Afghan government is set up, the executive has control over most appointments that are influential throughout the country. All the governors are appointed, all of the police chiefs are appointed by the executive in Kabul. And so therefore there's a large degree of discretion as to who gets chosen for that post. There is a program to vet, to review the qualifications of officials that are appointed, and it has criteria about corruption and criminality in it. That needs to be better enforced, and that's something that the international community should push, but really it should be the Afghan government recognizing on its own that it's not going to win hearts and minds of its own people if it doesn't appoint better people into power. You also need, on the non-governmental side, to continue supporting civil society and local and elected local government. The Constitution of Afghanistan calls for district council elections, it calls for village council elections, it calls for mayoral elections, none of which have been held for a variety of technical reasons. And they can't be held in the next year or so. But a lot of work needs to be done to get local governance going and to empower local interest groups to affect positively the choices that their government makes in terms of where they spend money, how power is apportioned, and so forth. And so I think that the international community recognizes the need for local governance, and I think there's resistance on the part of the Afghan government to let go of power. Ministries want to keep it in Kabul. Governors want to obviously control their province if they're given the opportunity to. But this is something where if the international community, and the US in particular, is planning to leave or hoping to leave starting in 12 to 18 months, there must be legitimate local institutions which can take over. It's not going to be done by the national government, which has never had significant control over the rural areas of Afghanistan. It's going to have to be controlled locally, and setting up the institutions to make that successful are a critical need right now.
Obviously, there's the economic aspect of it. It controls the third largest reserves of oil in the world. Whether we like it or not, the uninterrupted flow of oil is critical to our economy. It's critical to the global economy, the functioning of the global economy. Oil is a fungible commodity, so if you have an Islamist takeover in Iraq, or if the country completely breaks down and that oil production goes offline, not only do we suffer, everyone suffers. You know, global oil prices spike, $150, $200 a barrel. Again, you can write that off, but when oil prices spike like that, people starve. People need oil for fertilizers. Poor countries depend on cheap oil for transportation, for agriculture, for any number of things. So obviously oil plays a role. It's also important for us, I think, because Iraq sits along these fault lines, because we are sort of in a contest with Iran right now for influence in the region. What happens in Iraq matters in this regard. If Iraq becomes an Iranian proxy state, that has important implications for the Middle East. It realigns the balance of power. It makes the Sunni Arab countries there very nervous, who then begin to support and fund their own militias inside Iraq. And you start going down a dangerous path. It has implications, potentially positive implications for the region and for the United States. If Iraq succeeds as a democracy, eventually, we probably won't know for 10, 15 years, but if Iraq turns out to be an example where Arabs and Muslims can go to the polls in the Middle East just like everyone else, you know, there's this debate forever about whether or not, you know, Muslims and Islam was compatible with democracy, and can Muslims be Democrats, and is democracy okay with Islam? Now, I always thought that was ridiculous, because obviously most of the Muslims in the world already are Democrats. They live in Indonesia, the most populous Muslim country. They live in India, the second most populous Muslim country, where they're all voting in elections. In Turkey, there's obviously tens of millions of Muslims in the West that engage in elections all the time. But in the Arab world, you don't have this. Lebanon is a quasi-democracy, but you don't, they're all essentially dictatorships, some of them soft dictatorships, but they're autocratic regimes. If you have an example of a country where people are exercising their rights right next door, people elsewhere in the Arab world will start asking, why not us? And they deserve that right, just like everyone else. So that's why I think it's important.
Ideas with limited foreign intervention. do you believe that the U.S. expects that we're doing a disservice to the Middle East by constantly intervening and getting in their business and imposing our systems and our beliefs onto them?
I mean, I can speak to the example of Afghanistan, which is maybe one of the more extreme ones, given where Afghanistan has been over the last few decades. I mean, there's definitely a balance to be made here, and certainly imposing a very progressive Western system on Afghanistan is a bit of a shock to the system and perhaps a bit counterproductive. That said, I think there does need, if you do accept that having democratic states is a goal for moral reasons, for peace and security, for the quality of governance, which I accept, there needs to be some jump starting that happens here. I mean, there is no experience of democracy in Afghanistan save for an election or two in the 1960s. There's really no cultural, talking about Afghan culture, not about, I agree with the comments about Islam, but there's no Afghan culture for democracy that anybody knows or remembers. And so there does need to be a significant amount of international guidance and setup, or else it would never work. So I think that there needs to be a give and take. I think that a certain amount of, maybe a greater degree of local ownership in terms of how does this play out would be warranted. But at the same time, I mean, if you give into a system where you have, corrupt leaders who have ruled by the gun for many years, a choice between a democracy or a system which they can maintain and continue to control and dominate, obviously they're going to choose the old ways. And so there needs to be some push to get over that hump so that people can get to a point where they can freely decide, well, what is the best system and what is the best mix for us?
Because I've heard this several times too, that the West, we are sort of imposing our system on these countries. And I understand this to a degree, but democracy is obviously in some ways the absence of imposition. I mean, we can't impose a system on somebody if we are giving them the choice to choose what kind of system they want. I mean, the U.S. isn't going in and saying, okay, this is exactly how you have to do this. This is who you have to vote for. These are the laws you have to write. We are actually doing the opposite of imposing ourselves. The dictators who came before us were imposing themselves. We are saying you have the choice to make your own system. If you want to write Islamic laws, that's fine. Many of them did in Afghanistan and Iraq. They actually now aren't having anything imposed on them. They were having the choice. The people are having the choice to write their own laws. And that might be an idealistic way to look at it, but I think giving people the choice, I find it hard to see that we impose it. And second of all, we have somewhat of a responsibility. If we fund the autocrats who suppress democracy for some time, and we give them money and arms and capability to suppress their people, we can't just take a hands-off approach and then say, well, if the people want an uprising, then they have to do it themselves. We almost have a responsibility to these people. I mean, sometimes you need foreign assistance. We, some would argue, needed the French to gain our independence. We needed assistance. Sometimes if a democratic people want their rights, the government may be too strong for them to get them. That's not always the case, but sometimes it is.
I can only address really Afghanistan, and what I will say about that is that, Afghanistan has had various attempts at constitutionalism. I think that would be a better phrase. Under King Zahar in the 1960s, it didn't pan out well because the local communities didn't want it. You have to remember that Afghanistan, if you go out of Kabul, you've entered a different world, a different era. So that's the first thing we have to appreciate. We're dealing with people with different values and with different tradition. The second thing I think it's important to remember, it's not America alone in Afghanistan. I know there is this perception that America is really leading the charge, and it is. But there are other countries involved. The Japanese are playing an important role in demobilization. So if anybody is to blame, if it's anything, it's the international community. Okay? we really messed up in Afghanistan. We, the international community, not we, the United States. And there is that perception, especially after Iraq, to really blame America for everything. What happened in Afghanistan is that, first of all, after the Bonn Accord, we didn't have the right people at the discussion table. We completely left out the Northern Alliance, or at least the major players in the Northern Alliance. We believed that we could actually get Osama bin Laden without having assistance from the Pakistanis. I mean, I kept my presentation sort of only to Afghanistan, but Pakistan is a key element here. And if Pakistan doesn't want to see a democratic Afghanistan, we're never going to see one. It's that clear. So, and only really in the last 18 months, we're seeing Pakistanis brought to deal with the issue of Afghanistan. And again, here a lot of credit has to be placed on the US military, which has established various ties with the Pakistani military to deal with the Afghan situation. If it wasn't really for pressure from the Americans on the Pakistanis to close the Durand line, Pashtuns could literally walk across without any problems. So in terms of democratization, I think maybe we need to discuss democracy on a different level. That's the first thing. It's not going to be your Western type of democracy because you're dealing with an illiterate, poorly educated society. You're also dealing with a society that half of it, women, are simply not included in the discussion. We have to remember that aspect. I mean, Afghani women parliamentarians have to have special security when they come to and fro their parliament. I mean, that's ludicrous. So that's also an important element. They have no health care. I know health care is a big issue in the US, but I can assure you in Afghanistan it's just as big, although probably less divisive. So that's also an important issue to consider. And the final thing is that American democracy works for America. Okay? Or British democracy works in Britain. We need to start thinking about Afghani democracy for the Afghan model. And the final point I will say is that polls have actually shown that the Arab world, at least people in the Arab world, are very pro-democracy. They want democracy, they understand it, but very often they have problems because of the regimes that they're facing. If we look at Egypt and Mubarak, I mean, that's a classic example. So I think maybe the discourse has to change in terms of what type of democracy we want in Afghanistan or in anywhere else in the world.
I wanted to get your quick opinion if that can help turn around the situation. We've obviously made a mistake where we focused on capturing and killing terrorists, but now getting out to the communities and getting to know, kind of doing the drinking tea thing, is that something that you see as a way to fix our mistakes?
I think one thing I've noticed about Afghanistan and the American effort there is that it's constantly changing. I mean, I think the generals who are involved in Afghanistan are very positive and forward-thinking. I think Petraeus is certainly one of those individuals, as is McChrystal and Flynn and others. I'm not too sure that this is going to work because I don't think it's really addressing the nature of the Afghan community. We have to remember that in 2005, 2006, the Canadians and the British marched into Helmand. They claimed they cleansed it from the Taliban. Once they left, the Taliban came back. I mean, the Taliban are part of the community. And that's why, I mean, some people have suggested, we have to speak to the moderate elements of the Taliban. Now, again, I'm not clear what is a moderate Taliban. You're either a Taliban or you're not. You either have a very skewed version of reality I think the effort is commendable and I think it's showing a lot of initiative. I think the realization that it is security and reconstruction is very important. But I am not sure whether that security is sustainable. I mean, we want to bring the troops back home. We want to stop spending money in Afghanistan. We haven't even addressed the opium issue. And that, of course, is a major problem. And again, we can't address the opium issue without dealing with Pakistan and the whole trucking industry there and the Karachi mafia. We've got Uzbekistan and that kind of the Silk Route element. So we're really dealing with a piecemeal strategy. And I think that's really where we're failing. I mean, the initiative, the various surges, they work. But what the Taliban do is that they hide in the mountains, and once the soldiers leave, they come back. And they use pretty nasty means to get their ways across. You're either with us or you're against us. And they punish families for it. So, and people in Afghanistan remember things. You know, you're going to remember if somebody came into your house, took your son, tortured him, and again, I emphasize that it's really the most horrific of tortures, and then let them go. We saw that in Waziristan. I mean, in 2001, when the campaign began in Afghanistan, you know, we put pressure on Musharraf to deal with the Taliban issue in Waziristan. What did they do? They just went from South Waziristan to North Waziristan, hid away, intimidated the population, established bases, and now we have a major problem. Again, though I think it's commendable that we are thinking about new ideas, until we address the root problem, which is corruption, nepotism, the whole element of it, we really don't have that much, we're not going to change the system that much.
I wonder if I could just jump in on that. I definitely agree with what you said. And I think, again, this is why governance is important, and it's recognized by McChrystal in the Coin strategy, and local governance in particular, is that, you know, whether it works or not with the people that are practicing it, the military has too short a timeline and too few people, even in the best case scenario, to actually implement change on their own. They're working in Marja and soon to be Kandahar on a model to try to bring the Afghan government in a much more integrated fashion with them. But the bottom line is, you know, in Kosovo you had a large international effort and a population of, I think, less than 2 million people, or around 2 million people. And even then it took years and lots of hand-holding and, you know, not fully successful. I mean, Afghanistan is, you know, more than 10 times larger. And the military can only do so much, even if this is exactly the perfect strategy, which I wouldn't say. So again, it's really setting up the space and coming up with the mechanisms to get the Afghan government and to get local government that's legitimate in place so that they can move out.
Elements such as the Baptists who are marginalized through de-Baptification, do you see a threat in that, or are these more or less fringe elements that are kind of pushed out by Iraq?
I hope I didn't paint like a rosy picture when I gave my presentation earlier. I don't think we're by any means in the clear. I think there are great challenges ahead. I tried to go through some of them. The risks are great, but that doesn't make it less important. It doesn't mean we should, it's hard, or it's difficult, or we're unlikely to succeed, so we should take our eye off the ball. I mean, we've spent $700 billion, we've lost 4,300 lives. That doesn't mean you double down because you already have an investment, but you know, it does mean we have a responsibility not only to those people, but to the Iraqis that have helped us out, to the region. The challenge is, you know, the challenge of civil war, again, I would say is low. It was a very traumatic experience for the Iraqis. Nobody wants to go back to civil war. I forget, it's 34,000 killed in 2006, I believe. Yeah, 34,000 civilians killed in 2006. By last year, that was down to 3,000. I mean, 3,000 over the course of a year is somewhat normal figure for a country, as odd as that sounds. Iraqis have very vivid memories of that. They have no intention to return to civil war. They've rejected al-Qaeda. I think there's very little possibility for al-Qaeda to return to Iraq and to turn it into another safe haven. The one risk, the great risk, I think, lies with the Iraqis. This election is going to be critical. The next government that's formed is going to be critical. If Maliki joins with the other Shiite Islamist parties, if the Sunnis feel marginalized again, that's when you see Sunnis start turning to more Islamist fringe groups like al-Qaeda. I mean, al-Qaeda comes in and acts as the protectors of the Sunnis. You know, they're Shiite militias, they're out to get you, you're being marginalized, we can protect you, we can assassinate them. This is when they welcome in Islamist radicalists like that. So it's very important that the new government is inclusive, denounces the sort of sectarian politics of the old, that the ministries are cleaned up, that the militias are weeded out of the security forces. There's already been a lot of progress in this regard for the Iraqi army. The police has much greater distance to go, but even they're getting better. As far as regional influence goes, it's actually very similar along the same sectarian lines. If Maliki joins with Islamic Shiite parties, they grow closer to Iran. The Saudis end up trying to support the marginalized Sunnis, who they're sort of the patron of the Sunnis of Iraq, and you could have a regional game of influence or proxy war in Iraq. So everything really comes down now at this point to Iraq's leaders. Do they step up to the plate? Do they govern nationally? Do they govern inclusively, progressively, or do they sort of revert to short-term gains and just try and appeal to, you know, the most base ethnic or sectarian tendencies of the people and you know, cause divisions and stir up their communities against other communities for short-term political gain? And there's steps forward, steps away from this, but we're not there yet.
Form that they fill out, and what about this problem? You know, it's not going to be Switzerland, but how will they unite a country with all these language problems?
About Afghanistan is interesting that it has two languages, Pashto and Dari, which are the dominant tongues, Pashto for the Pashtuns and Dari for, generally speaking, the northerners. It also has a photo of the candidate and a symbol, because the illiteracy rates are so high that most people can't read the Dari or the Pashto. So you'll see campaign posters, they'll have obviously the candidate's photo on it, but then you'll have a little symbol, sheaves of wheat or something like that, so people can recognize them on the ballot. In terms of ethnic and language differences and whether that divides the country, you know, I think that, you know, obviously the ethnic differences are significant. They're a dominant feature of politics in Afghanistan. But I wouldn't take it too far and to assume that these different groups cannot get along. My experience is if you ask any Afghan, even if they're the most ardent Pashtun nationalists, to label their identity, they will first identify themselves as an Afghan. You know, they will say, I'm a Pashtun if it's the right context, but people do see themselves as part of a nation. And that's important. So you don't have Balkan-style tendencies for dissolution in Afghanistan. However, of course, you know, relations are tense between several of the ethnic groups. You know, I think that that's where the parliament and the parliamentary elections come in. You know, if you have reasonably fair elections that reasonably represent the population of the different communities, which is itself a very sensitive political issue, but if you have them represented in parliament, where they can argue out their differences in a legislative forum, I think there is definitely an ability to get along. If you have a process that doesn't fairly apportion representation according to, you know, people's perceptions of where they are in the mix of ethnicities in Afghanistan, then you're going to have a problem. Then you could have civil war, but it's based more on power than ethnic hatred. And I think just in terms of them speaking to each other, really, you know, I think relatively few Dari speakers speak Pashto, but most educated Pashto speakers also speak Dari. So that is kind of, it's again a tense issue at times, but communication between these groups is at the government level fairly smooth.
Yeah. I think it's also important to remember that what you're dealing here is with alliance making. If it's worthy, if it's going to help me preserve my position in government, or whether it is on the central level or the local level, I'm going to form an alliance. I mean, we saw that in 2009 when Karzai brought in, you know, accepted what some NGOs have described as the marriage rape law, you know, that's to do with women within, I think it was the Shia community, sort of legalizing, if you like, you know, rape within marriage, which a lot of the NGOs were up in arms with, but, you know, as I think was indicated, I mean, Karzai was able to do it because he needed the votes. He gave in, and we, the West, simply accepted it, which I think is a shocking element. I think it's completely unacceptable that we've allowed that to take place. In Afghanistan, I think it works like, if it serves my purposes, I will do what I can, and I think that's why the system is so unstable. Until we realize that people look first of all at the interests of the family, the clan, the tribe, and the confederation, we're not going to get anywhere. And I think that's where our problem starts. I mean, after all, we first of all look first after our families. So why shouldn't they? Except that their concept of the family is largely larger than ours. So it's those kind of elements. I think it's cultural differences and cultural nuances that we've really failed to appreciate when we're looking into certain parts of the world, not just Afghanistan.
16 of the hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, yet none of them were from Iran. Why are we emphasizing more about Iran, which never attacked any of their neighbors or attacked us, and yet nothing happens in Saudi Arabia?
I think when you have an individual as a president of a country who says some of the things that President Ahmadinejad has said, it attracts criticism, for lack of a better term. I think that's an issue. As far as I know, Iran hasn't been attacked by the United States. And as far as I'm aware, there are no plans to attack Iran. In fact, last week, President Obama made overtures towards the Iranian government. I think there is a repeated effort to improve relations with Iran. That was certainly one of President Obama's agendas as he ran for office. There is some concern, and I think when we're looking at Iran, we have to look at Iran in two ways. I mean, there is the Iranian people who have shown what they are capable and what they are made of during the recent election, and then I think there is the Republican Guards. And maybe the Republican Guards are really the issue that we have to focus on. I think that maybe that's where the discussion has to center. There are reports of members of the Republican Guard, for example, assisting or working with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Now that in itself is a worry because there is a very important border between the two. There is, of course, a very important border between Pakistan and Iran, in Balochistan, where there is constant tension. I think Iran is at a stage where it needs to decide whether it's going to tone down some of its more belligerent rhetoric and really embrace the international community. And by that, remove some of the pariah emphasis that we've attached to it. Or whether it will continue with the same attitude that doesn't win it any allies or friends within the larger international community.
Exactly how significant is the effect of Afghan poppy crop on stability, and are there any reasonable proposals addressing that?
As far as I know, the war against drugs has been taking place for quite some time, and last time I checked, we're not exactly winning it. So I'm not too sure that we're going to win it in Afghanistan anytime soon. I think if you check in Colombia, you'll see that we haven't won that one yet, and that's been taking on for quite some time. It's interesting that the price of opium has certainly reduced because of the increase in poppy crop, and in fact, it has made wheat production much more beneficial nowadays in Afghanistan. When we talk about opium production in Afghanistan, we have to sort of break it down into two elements. There is, of course, the Taliban influence, whereby they see it as a useful way to raise money quickly. But there is also, of course, the position of the local farmers who, I mean, the poppy crop in itself is a good crop if you're in a really bad situation. The land is problematic, it doesn't get a lot of water, and the poppy develops very quickly in that. So the Afghan farmer who's very, very poor and has a relatively large family uses it to earn money. The program between 2001 and sort of 2007 that the United States had sort of promoted of eradication through the air didn't win it a lot of favors amongst the communities. It alienated a lot of local Afghans. The British, who were leading the opium, the campaign against drugs, adopted a more of we're going to go into the village and basically destroy the crops. That's very man-intensive, it's very risky, and it's very problematic. But it was more effective, but we didn't destroy so much. So I think our position in terms of the opium situation has to, again, deal with the Karachi Mafia, who are ferrying it, the really problematic border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, through which most of the opium is shipped or sort of ferried across, and finally with the local Afghan population. if you have no other means to provide for your family, you'll do whatever you can, whether it is pick up a gun and join the Taliban or sell drugs. So we have to figure out a way to encourage the Afghan population to find different means, which at the same time also we have to provide them with security so that the Taliban won't force them to harvest the poppy crop. There's the other issue that we have to consider. As you're harvesting the poppy crop, you're also becoming addicted to it. So we also have to deal with the fact that we are having a very large opium-based society. And here again, we might have to deal with the Iranians because they have an issue with drug abuse, and they're taking a lot of the opium of Afghanistan. So this has to take place on a much larger element. We have to bring in the Pakistanis. We'll have to bring in the Iranians to deal with the opium problem. There's no way around it. And of course, the Central Asian republics, which is the land route for the opium issue. And of course, provide the local population with something else to harvest.
Just to add, I agree with that analysis, but there's an interesting article in the paper just yesterday that showed a picture of U.S. soldiers in Helmand, in the Marja area, walking through a poppy fields, which the reporter noted they did not eradicate. And this, I think, is a vivid example of a shift in U.S. policy. I think many people were advocating for a long time that this needs to be seen, as you've said, as a social and a political problem, not just this is illegal and needs to be outlawed problem. And that's certainly the approach they're taking in Marja, and I expect to be replicated elsewhere.
Considering the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan runs right through the middle of Pashtun stronghold, do you see that being a continuing area of instability beyond Taliban fighters simply taking sanctuary in Pakistan?
There is no doubt that it is a major issue. I think it's a misnomer to assume that Afghanistan and Pakistan are chums. Right? They really don't like one another. It's important to remember that in 1947, when in the General Assembly, the only country to vote against Pakistan becoming an independent state was Afghanistan. There is tremendous amount of animosity, and it goes back to 1896 when the line was drawn by the British. So if you want to blame somebody, blame the Brits. It always works. So we'll start with that element. Now, since then, since the Durand Line, there's been tremendous amount of animosity. I mean, because essentially what we've done is that we've took an ethnic group known as the Pashtun, and we've divided them arbitrarily, as we've done in other parts of the world. So in the 1950s, for example, there was tremendous amount of tension between the two. At one point, even the Pakistani government closed the border, which meant that goods from Afghanistan couldn't get to Karachi, i.e. to the port, and be shipped out. And it's always at the back of the Afghans' mind that, you know, if they don't play nice with the Pakistanis, the border will be closed, and then where do they send their goods? And that's an important element to remember. So you need to develop some sort of a relationship, a better relationship between Afghanistan and Pakistan. When Musharraf was in power, there was a total lack of a relationship because Musharraf and Karzai simply did not like one another. So discourse really kind of collapsed. And then what happened is that the Taliban were able to move back and forth because there was no cooperation on the Pakistani side to close the border. Now, again, this goes back to the 1970s, when after the revolution in 1973, when King Zahar was overthrown, a lot of the Islamists escaped Afghanistan and moved to Pakistan, to the border area, to Balochistan, to the Northwest Frontier Province. And who trained them? Well, the Frontier Corps and the ISI. Actually, General Badar, who became the Secretary of Interior in the 1990s, was the man responsible for almost, if you like, establishing the Mujahideen a few years later. Now, as that develops, tension continues because Pakistan, because it is smaller than Afghanistan, it is always apprehensive about Afghanistan. It always fears Afghanistan. And it works for its benefit that Afghanistan is relatively unstable. And that's why, for many years, we saw a tremendous amount of, we saw maybe a lack of commitment from the Pakistanis really to deal with the Afghan problem. Nowadays, under the current administration, and certainly with General Kiani as the head of the army, we're seeing greater initiative. As the surge is taking place in Helmand and probably in Kandahar, I mean, the Pakistanis have pushed up to the border. I don't think it's been sufficient. I really think we need to have individuals from the international community really along the Afghan-Pakistan border. But that's a completely different issue. I don't think the Pakistanis are ready to have foreign troops on their soil. But until we have that, we really are not going to deal with the weak border between these two countries. So I don't really have an answer for that.
And in Iraq, if the Kurds successfully set up an autonomous enclave or state within northern Iraq, do you see Iran and Turkey tolerating that? Or would they choose to directly intervene?
I don't know that I have a great answer for you. It's uncertain. Turkey has had a more problematic relationship with the Kurds than Iran has, and when these questions were being raised some time ago, Turkey took a very hard stance. In fact, several years ago, 2004, 2005, there was a bombing campaign in northern Iraq by Turkish forces targeting Kurdish terrorist groups operating out of northern Iraq, hitting targets inside Turkey. This has been a problem. Turkey has been fighting Kurdish separatists for decades, and their main concern is that these groups will eventually use an autonomous Kurdistan to launch attacks against Turkey and to make a bid and to rile up Turkey's own Kurdish population. That seems to have calmed in recent years. There has not been as much of attention on it. Exactly what they would do now Turkey, it's important to remember, is the #1 investor in Iraqi Kurdistan. So economic relations have actually been growing quite strongly between the two parts, but they're still very sensitive on the political ramifications of an independent Kurdish region. Iran is the same case. Both of these countries are obviously sensitive to this because they have minority Kurdish populations adjacent to Iraqi Kurdistan. These groups generally feel oppressed, marginalized, and the Iranians and the Turks worry what kind of precedent this would set. The Iranians and the Turks have actually been cooperating quite close. I mean, these were regional rivals for quite some time, and since the rise of the AKP in Turkey, which is a sort of mildly Islamist party, Turkey has moved from a fiercely secular Muslim country to a slightly more Islamist, has pulled slightly away from the United States and from Israel. Turkey's a NATO member, but relations with the U.S. have soured a bit. It's been moving closer to Iran and Syria. They've been coordinating and cooperating on regional issues to a much greater degree. So to see them take a coordinated stance on the Kurdish issue, which they have done before, even when they were hostile, isn't beyond them. But as far as their exact response, I couldn't assume.
Will the result of the election they hold there promotes more conflicts between religions and ethnics instead of bringing them real democracy?
Well, let me just take this for Iraq quickly. I've said a few times I think this is the critical point, whether or not the Iraqi politicians move away from a sectarian-based language, political philosophy, campaign platform. And I think in some respects, the trends here have been encouraging. There were provincial elections last year, and you could see it in the national parliamentary elections just this month. The Islamist sectarian dialogue has been diluted. You do have just the sheer popularity of Iyad Alawi, who made this remarkable comeback on the back of a secular, non-confessional platform appealing to all parties. The fact that he did so well shows that there is groups that I think that Iraqis are sort of fed up with this type of politics. even Maliki, who is a Shiite who came into politics in a broad-based Shiite coalition, has made himself out to be a nationalist. He's distanced himself from Iran. When he was prime minister, he instituted a rule, oversaw the passing of a law before provincial elections banning the use of religious posters in the lead up to elections. So I think actually the trend has been away from, even the pure Islamists in the INA, the Shiite Islamist parties, have been dumbing down their divisive rhetoric and trying to come across as Arab nationalists, as Iraqi nationalists, as you know, we are all Iraqis. We are not Shiites and Sunnis and Kurds anymore. So while the risk is that this progress could be reversed, as always, I think the trends are positive.
I'll take the Afghanistan question. I mean, I think that the risk there is not particularly religious. The Hazara minority is also Shia, but you don't hear that expressed so much in religious terms as in ethnic terms, because the Hazara are also considered an ethnic group. One interesting thing to watch with the reconciliation effort that's about to begin with the Taliban is how do they accommodate the Taliban's fairly extreme religious demands. The Afghan people really, you know, they are deeply Muslim, but they are not Islamist, and they are not, as a cultural phenomenon, they're not particularly radical. And in fact, you know, one of the reasons for the Taliban's extreme unpopularity is because their Wahhabist or Deobandi interpretation of Islam is out of touch with even conservative Afghanistan. Nonetheless, of course, the Taliban, one of their key demands is religious. It's in terms of ruling Afghanistan according to their interpretation of Islam. Now, I don't think that will play out in the ballot box, but it will play out somehow in terms of giving up power in government to ministries, giving ministries to Taliban leaders, and so on. And it will be interesting just to watch whether they wind up getting the Ministry of Hajj and the Ministry of Religion so that they can start to impart maybe more conservative Islam than Afghanistan has been accustomed to, or not. But in terms of ethnic lines, you know, that is the potential for tension and conflict that will play out on the electoral field. And I mean, I think there has been a tacit acceptance by most Afghans that the leader must be Pashtun. The Pashtuns demand it, and this goes back in the history that was already explained. And there's not that much tension there. And of course, 2 vice presidents were created in the presidential system so that you could essentially balance between the 3 major ethnic groups. And people have generally accepted that. I mentioned before that there hasn't been a census, and this is really where the intersection of ethnic divide and elections and power plays out, and they haven't had a census for that reason, because everybody's afraid of what will happen if the conventional wisdom about population is proved not to be true in terms of, you know, Pashtuns see themselves as a majority, they probably are the most populous. Everybody is discriminated against the Hazara, which are actually probably far more populous than is credited, because the last census was in 1979. And then, of course, the northern groups are smaller, the Tajiks and the Uzbeks, but they're ones that have a strong territorial incentive to resist Pashtuns that would be taking their land, and Taliban in particular. So as you go forward, what I was saying is, you know, right now there's an accepted kind of balance of power between these ethnic groups, and if that is reflected in how the parliament is composed or how national government is composed, then things are okay. You know, you'll compete along other lines. But if one ethnic group seeks dominance above and beyond what's currently been allotted, then you can have some extreme tensions that might result in violence.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I think we still have to see what's going to happen in terms of the negotiation with the Taliban. And if there are, in fact, negotiations with the Taliban, it's a bit tricky to know. We do know that recently a member of the Karzai has reached out to Hiktamal. That's a little bit worrying because he's not a nice person, to say the least. we have to remember that in the mid-1990s, you know, he bombshelled Kabul, killing between 10,000 to 25,000, depending as to who you listen to. And again, you know, we're thinking about possibly bringing this person into government. Well, you know, have you heard of the ICC? Have you heard about, you know, war crimes? How is that going to play? And that's going to be a major issue to consider in terms of the reconciliation, because Afghans are already talking about the day after, once there is peace and security. The one thing that sort of seems to always reoccur in Afghanistan is when things sort of go pear-shaped, people revert to Islam. The notion of the Ummah sort of brings people together. The problem then is that you have groups like the Talib coming in, and they impose their own sense of value. What's really significant about the Taliban is that they're not stupid. They really understand the mentality, and what they do is that they don't demand too much in terms of what they take from the community. I mean, there's a recent example where, whereas, you know, a local Afghan warlord would take, let's say, 30 or 40% of your earning, a local Taliban commander would only take 10 or 12%. And even then, he would use that. He would say, I'm only taking it as zakat, i.e. as charity, to finance the war against the occupiers. So again, it's being couched in religious language, which any proper Muslim understands. Zakat is one of the pillars of Islam. You're supposed to do it. So I think unless we're very, very careful, religious discourse is going to increasingly dominate Afghan politics, especially if people like Hiktamar and others sort of are brought into, away from, if you like, you know, from the periphery into the center, because these guys want power, above all else, and they will use whatever means possible to impose that. And it's often done at the expense of, the local community, which have to bear suffer the consequences, but also, unfortunately, it's going to be international forces who are there trying to bring a better tomorrow for Afghanistan.